From synth new wave pop to straight up disturbing industrial metal. The pioneers of a new aggressive genre, fronted by a man that should have died before he even made his first record. During an era of pretty boys and 80s romanticism, came one of the most influentially dark records of the decade. Leader of this chaotic musical cult, Al Jourgensen, would live a substance-driven life that would put Ozzy Osbourne to shame.
Rock and roll!
This is Jesus Built My Hotrod, the story of Ministry.
The ministry bidding has begun!
Ministry is hailed as one of the foremost pioneers of industrial rock and industrial metal, with 17 studio albums spanning 42 years, although if you ask Mr. Jourgensen, he may disagree with that. This is a group that has influenced more artists than you probably realize. From Nine Inch Nails to Slipknot, Hatebreed, Fear Factory, and even Jello Biafra of Dead Kennedys have nothing but praise for Al Jourgensen and his visionary talents when it comes to Ministry. Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails once said Ministry was the single most important influence and concept of Nine Inch Nails. But that's pretty obvious if you've literally heard any song by Nine Inch Nails. This type of influence will most likely be nothing new to most people. However, one thing that many people don't realize is Al Jourgensen, the man behind Ministry, has lived a rock and roll life that is so outrageously wild, it makes Ozzy Osbourne look like a Girl Scout.
Rock and roll!
Sorry, Ozzy, we love you really. Just have a look at this fine quote taken from the book, Ministry, The Lost Gospels, according to Al Jourgensen, written by the man himself. You know when you're in trouble when you try to say goodbye to your wife and all you can do is gargle blood. I was dying. Well, that was nothing new. I tempted fate for more than 4 decades. I've had kidney failure, hepatitis A, B, and C, and tried to invent D. But all the doctors I saw were too dumb to grasp my creativity. I lost a toe, all my teeth, and nearly an arm. And I overdosed on substances twice and had to be resuscitated. Now, I am in no way glorifying this type of lifestyle or reckless behavior. However, I think it's important to understand this type of perspective when we're delving into one of the most devious minds in alternative music. Ministry was the rock and roll, the underdog of the underdogs, and seemingly one true gateway to hell.
Do you play new wave, or what's the nature of the material that you offer to your...
I don't know.
You have no idea.
But it seemed from day one, Al Jourgensen was always one step away from death's door. Born in 1958 in Cuba by the name Alejandro Ramirez Casas. His mother was just 16 and he had no idea who his father was. He was born 3 months premature, and his survival at birth alone was one of many miracles that would keep him alive over the years. Back in 1958, babies who were born 3 months premature didn't live. No 3 months premature, you're dead. But somehow I wasn't. And I wasn't in some fancy American hospital. I was born in Havana, Cuba, a third world country that's just as likely to use dying fetuses as kindling for the poor as they were to fight to keep them alive. I was jaundiced with a failing liver. I was completely yellow, even my eyes. I had 60% hearing loss. In other words, I was a mess long before I entered the music industry. Jourgensen and his family were basically forced to leave Cuba thanks to the rise of the Fidel Castro regime. According to Jourgensen, his family was living in a rather splendid mansion and Castro forcibly took it in 1960, so his family decided to move to Miami when Jourgensen was just around 2 years old. And who knows, maybe if Jourgensen wasn't raised in America, he may have never been exposed to the sounds that would influence Ministry, so who knew Fidel Castro would indirectly play a part in the development of one of the greatest industrial metal outfits we've ever seen. Although I'll admit, that's a bit of a stretch. I will quickly say, I know Al pronounces his surname with a hard J, Jourgensen. However, I've been living in Scandinavia for a few years, and most J's are soft, and given this is a Nordic surname by nature, I'm probably going to, out of habit, pronounce his name with a soft J as Jourgensen, so forgive me. Al's grandfather, who moved the family to Miami, was apparently a chess champion and even taught Al how to play as a kid. My grandfather was the patriarch of the family, the suavest character in history. He was a chess champion, and I remember him sitting planning out his next move with a glass of Jack Daniels in one hand and a cigar in the other. He taught me chess and he'd let me win. I never knew he was throwing the games on purpose. That gave me a lot of confidence growing up and made me feel smart. Little did I know. But he was my hero. Music, though, was seemingly always present for Al and played a big role in not just his life, but his family's also. My great-uncle, Leo Brouwer, was a famous classical guitar player, probably the best after Segovia. My great-great-aunt, Ernestina Lacona Casoda, was married to the conductor of a famous orchestra in Spain, who is credited for writing the famous folk song La Malaguena. But folklore has it that it was my great-great-aunt who wrote it. He just got credit for it because they didn't give women recognition for writing songs in those days. And I have to assume Al is referring to Andrés Segovia, a famous Spanish virtuoso classic guitarist born in 1893. We can actually hear some of his work along with Leo Brouwer, Al's great uncle. And of course, we have to hear a little bit of La Malaguena. And believe it or not, some of this Cuban and Spanish influence and culture was directly integrated into ministry music. My uncles would play tribal Cuban music on congas and everyone would sing. That's where I got my first taste of contractual beats and triplets, and it stuck with me. If you listen to Ministry, even the really old stuff like Halloween, Deity, Burning Inside, and up through Double Tap from Relapse, you can hear that contractual style blended with metal and whatever keyboard stuff I was doing. And if you're wondering why he's called Al Jourgensen as opposed to his Cuban birth name, that's simple. His mother eventually married a man called Ed Jourgensen, and she took the surname. But that wasn't the only thing that changed for Al. After moving to America, he couldn't even speak English, and was now being taught in a Catholic school where he would regularly get a beating from nuns for being left-handed. Apart from that, I guess you could say Al led a pretty normal childhood. Well, apart from the times he was visited by aliens. When I was living with Carmen, I had my first of several run-ins with the Greys. If you're into UFOs and extraterrestrials, you know the Greys are these little fuckers from another planet who come down to Earth once in a while and check it out. They've been keeping an eye on me from an early age. I didn't get the name Alien Jourgensen for nothing. When I was 5, 3 of these guys paid me a visit. I was watching them and they were watching me. And before they went away, they left this little green triangle on my neck. Aliens, though, would soon take a back seat and Al would discover rock and roll. The year was 1967, and it wasn't Elvis or the Beatles that would capture his imagination. It would be the Rolling Stones.
I see a red door and I want it painted black.
The guitarist had this total "f*** you" attitude. The drummer played like a cool, calm machine, and the singer danced in this weird way, almost like a marionette. Although the singer wasn't particularly good looking, all the girls were screaming. The band was the Rolling Stones. They were performing Paint It Black from Aftermath, and they embodied everything the nuns at school had warned me about. It was practically satanic, and I was hooked. I immediately went out and got this Stones t-shirt with the tongue logo. Other kids in the neighborhood wore Monkees shirts and Beatles shirts and made fun of me for backing a loser band. Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, and ZZ Top would also be big influences on Al, and before he knew it, he had a drum kit, then a guitar. Although his stepdad was trying to force him to focus on baseball, but Al had other plans. And those plans involved substances, lots and lots of substances. Al's teenage years were spent being pretty rebellious. We had this shitty LSD on paper, but when you're a kid and you're tripping balls and listening to music, it's like pure freedom. The very first time I was actually arrested was when I was 13, and Scott's mum called the police on me for stealing her diabetic needles. That started a downhill trend. I couldn't go to a Walgreens without getting at least detained for shoplifting. Getting wasted and stealing cars became a speciality for Scott and me. He even found himself in a mental institution for 12 months because he became so out of control. And honestly, this is only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Jourgensen's formative years. By the time he was 18 though, he would soon be in his very own covers band with some friends in college. They would play covers by Blue Oyster Cult, Lynyrd Skynyrd, and Aerosmith, and the covers band was called Slayer. Obviously, the name Slayer didn't stick, and another group, of course, would go on to have success with that handle. Al would soon be introduced to a much more unique set of sounds when he started to date a woman called Shannon. I say this would have been his first real taste of experimental music. Life with Shannon was pretty wild. She made me put away the Stones and Zeppelin records, kicking and screaming, and had me listen to crazy English stuff like Public Image Limited, Bauhaus, Throbbing Gristle, and Joy Division, as well as krautrock like Can, Faust, Neu, and Kraftwerk. Bauhaus, Throbbing Gristle, and Kraftwerk are arguably the most important names here when it comes to the influence of Ministry. This would be around the same time that Jourgensen joined a group called Special Effect. Officially labeled as a new wave and post-punk band, they would only release one studio album called Too Much Soft Living in 1980. Throbbing Gristle is without doubt the strangest group on this list, and you'll rarely hear their name. An electronic experimental group from the UK formed in 1975, releasing their debut album, The Second Annual Report, in 1977. Then we have Kraftwerk, a German electronic synth group that are essentially known as the innovators of electronic music, releasing 9 albums during the 80s and 90s alone. And finally, another big influence on Ministry would be an album called The Modern Dance, released in 1978 by an art punk avant-garde industrial rock band called Pere that formed in Cleveland, Ohio in 1975. There's a lot of different ways to interpret industrial. My biggest influence was The Modern Dance by Pere. They were still using crowd noises and samples and demented breaks and breakdowns that were complete non sequiturs in the song. That's what really floated my boat. I've never heard them called an industrial band, but to me, that was as industrial as it got. But the thing with industrial was that it was so diverse that you really couldn't pigeonhole it. It's like what Throbbing Gristle said. It was more the approach than the actual music. ZZ Top used sequencers and drum machines. Do you consider them an industrial band? Of course not. What is industrial as an actual genre? I'm still not sure. So I think it's safe to say that not only did Al Jourgensen have a wide range of strange and curious musical influences, along with some of the traditional rock pathways, he also had the influence of life experience from a very early age. And all of this would be channeled into the chaotic and innovative sound that would become Ministry.
They let me do the kind of music I want to do. Arista was always sticking their nose up my ass trying to make me write something commercial, and what came out was an abortion of an album called With Sympathy, which I strongly urge all of you to like burn, use them as ashtrays, throw them as frisbees, get rid of them because it's a worthless album.
The 1980s, synth pop, new wave, post-punk, and the new romantic movement were taking over. Groups such as Ultravox, Soft Cell, and Depeche Mode were all seeing huge commercial success with their relatively upbeat, yet mildly dystopian sounds, depending on which artist you were listening to at the time, and how depressed you were.
Tainted love.
And we can't forget the impact that Joy Division had already had with their only two records, Unknown Pleasures in 1979 and Closer in 1980. Their success, as we know, was only cut short after Ian Curtis tragically took his own life in 1980 at the age of just 23 years old. Depression seemed to be a pretty big underlying factor and was also something that felt embedded in much of the new wave and new romantic music. I guess you could say it was somewhat of a brooding mix of genres, and Ministry wanted their fair share. And I think it would be an absolute crime here to not mention the debut self-titled album from the post-punk industrial group Killing Joke, released in 1980. That was absolutely an influence on Mr. Jourgensen. In 1981, Ministry would release their first double single, I'm Falling and Cold Life, and oh boy, did it sound nothing like the Ministry we know of today. If anything, it sounds way more like A Forest, a single taken from The Cure's second studio album, 17 Seconds, released a year before in 1980. Ministry were even put on the same bill as The Police, Depeche Mode, and Culture Club, which looking back now seems like the strangest combination you could think of. In fact, Ministry wouldn't even sound like Ministry on their debut record with Sympathy, released in 1983. It seemed Al Jourgensen hadn't quite found his sound yet and was merely trying to imitate as opposed to innovate here. He even didn't really like the record himself that much. But this idea of imitating came more from the people around him rather than his own vision. I was living in a squat where literally I had a hole in my roof. I used to have to shovel snow out of my apartment. I had plugged stolen cables into a building that actually had power. And somebody offers me a record contract, I'm like, hell yeah, man. This sure beats a kick in the balls. The reasons I don't like that record are not really so much for the music as much as the surrounding dynamic of it. It's literally a label-appointed producer, label-appointed engineer, label-appointed background vocalist, label-appointed lyrics, label-appointed looks, or management-appointed looks. I had to sue to get off this label as soon as that record came out. I was so unhappy. And this is essentially why Ministry sounded and looked more like The Cure as opposed to, well, Ministry with their debut record with Sympathy and in the video for Revenge, released in 1983. Although the record did see chart success, peaking at number 96 on the Billboard 200, It was the record label molding and shaping Al Jourgensen's vision into something that just didn't represent who he really was. But this wouldn't last long. Ministry went from releasing with Sympathy in 1983, a record officially labeled as new wave, electro, synth pop, and even funk, to their second studio album, Twitch. That would be classed as electro and industrial. And this would be the start of the true era of Ministry.
I'm not a real big fan. The rest of the band likes playing live. I'm not a real big fan of playing live. I'd much rather be twiddling knobs in a studio. A lot of people would say I'd rather be twiddling knobs in a bathroom or a bedroom.
Even by Al Jourgensen's own admission, he sold out from the very beginning. He took the record deal with Arista Records because, well, it was a way to make money and not live in an apartment with a hole in the roof. However, he quickly regretted this decision and walked away from Arista Records. Not only did Arista reject most of Al's songs for the debut Ministry album, a lot of the songs on that album were written by writers appointed by the label, despite Al's name being credited as the writer. Those songs were just basically written by, you know, corporate level people at Arista Records at the time, and a lot of the stuff that was rejected for the first album wound up on Twitch and various other projects. In 1985, Ministry would release a new single called All Day, but it was the B-side to this record that caught the attention of the rising goth scene and became an instant underground classic, especially around Halloween. What everyone lost their shit over was Every Day is Halloween. To this day, I hate it, but people are still buying it. It's got this gothic vibe, this repetitive hook, and this vocal that goes boppy bop bop that people like. Radio stations always pull it out around Halloween, but it's not even about Halloween. It's about people giving you shit for having a mohawk. Why do you look like you're dressed for Halloween, you freak? In the song, I just railed against that. I didn't think it was going to strike a chord with anyone. While this was a big step towards Ministry finding their own sound and breaking free from the confines of the corporate music industry, well known for bleeding dry any creativity of anyone who dared to not conform, Al Jourgensen was still nowhere close to living what you could call a glamorous lifestyle as a rock star. He was actually writing TV and radio commercials. Here is one for Shasta Diet Cola from 1983. And yes, I believe this is also him singing.
Don't give me that soda, that same old cola.
He was also writing jingles for a company called Huffy that made bikes, and this is where he finally decided to leave the commercial jingle scene behind. The deal with Huffy came to an end when I gave them this song for a bike called the Panther, and at the end of this cheesy tune, they wanted me to purr loudly into the mic. I said, "F*** you, get someone else to purr, I quit." Every Day is Halloween was absolutely still in the tone of With Sympathy as it was written during that time period, but now we see a very clear shift from new wave synth pop into a more industrial and experimental feel with Ministry's second record, Twitch. Twitch would be the second studio album released by Ministry in 1986. It debuted at 194 on the Billboard 200 and showcased a much more electro-industrial, experimental sound compared to Ministry's earlier works. This is also when Ministry went from singing about Halloween to focusing on political narratives. When I was in Berlin in 1986, Reagan was still in office, the Cold War was still going on, and I was finishing up Twitch right on the edge of the Berlin Wall. I was doing vocals on the roof 15 yards from an East German sniper with MiG-15s flying. This guy was fucking with me all day, pointing his gun at me from his guard tower. The first real political Ministry song I actually put out was Just Like You from Twitch, which is bitching about Reagan's policies. When Twitch entered the Billboard charts in 1986, the music world wasn't exactly on an industrial musical high. Well, it wasn't really anything. It was still incredibly underground and still very much in the early stages of development. Industrial was kind of all over the place. However, 2 years earlier, you had the likes of KMFDM with their demo record Opium and Remission, an EP released by Skinny Puppy, both in 1984. KMFDM would release their debut record, What Do You Know, Deutschland, in 1986, and Skinny Puppy's first full studio album would be Bites, released in 1985. Both of which, though, were pretty tame compared to what Al Jourgensen was about to do with Ministry.
Ministry, you are watching 120 Minutes with Dave Kendall. Okay? Bye.
In 1988, Ministry would release arguably their most influential record to date.
Land of rape and honey.
The Land of Rape and Honey. And yes, it's YouTube. I have to censor that part out. From here on, I will refer to this record as LORA, simply an abbreviation of the album title. 1988 was without doubt a year that highlighted the pinnacle of synth pop and 80s free-loving good vibes. There really wasn't anything in the way of aggression topping the album charts. It was George Michael with Faith, Depeche Mode with Strangelove, or 10,000 Maniacs with Like the Weather.
Hear the sound of the noon bell chime.
Sure, there was a little bit of rock and roll with Aerosmith and Guns N' Roses, but that was all still, well, good time music. Lyrically, sure, some of the topics were dark, but the music was undeniably poppy. And this is why LORA is such an important record. LORA defined a new sound, and that sound was disturbing. It was the stuff that fueled nightmares. It was what Freddy Krueger probably would have used for relaxing bedtime music before coming into your dreams and devouring your soul. This was not pop. LORA helped to cross a very important boundary, musically. It combined sampling with distortion in a way that hadn't really been seen when mixed with sheer aggression and drugs. I was shooting up 8 to 10 times a day by that point. I realized I was a full-blown junkie because if I didn't get it that day, or if my dealer was late, I'd be freaking out and shaking and throwing up. That's when I realized I had a problem. This record was nothing short of dark. It makes Marilyn Manson's music sound like a 6-year-old's tea party. It combines punk, metal, thrash, electronica, and a pinch of disdain for humanity. This record melted heavy metal and industrial music together in a way that I don't think had ever been heard before. This album influenced the likes of Slipknot, 9 Inch Nails, and Fear Factory, and most likely opened up the gates for sampling in the world of heavy metal on a scale we may never have seen had it not been for LORA. Ministry was the gateway for getting metalheads into becoming more open-minded to accepting other elements into the music, like Metallica has Master of Puppets and Exodus has Bonded by Blood. LORA is the essential record for that era and that style of music. The album artwork alone should be enough to make you shiver in disbelief. What might appear to some as a completely random and digitally altered image of nothing, to others is the very representation of death and horror itself. When we finished The Land of Rape and Honey, I took a picture off of a TV documentary about the Holocaust. It was a shot of the Buchenwald concentration camp. I digitally distorted it so it was all grainy and looked nightmarish and psychedelic. I thought it would be a good cover for this mindfuck of an album. So not only was this a sonically disturbing record, it was quite literally a visual depiction of one of the worst atrocities mankind has ever witnessed. This album encompassed so many different genres into such a unique sound. There really isn't any other work you could even come close to comparing it to at that time. Ministry is not as much of a band or a movement as it is a culture. They have probably inspired me more as a songwriter than as a drummer or guitarist. They have the ability to throw you into a trance with a single riff for minutes on end and still retain a verse, chorus structure that actually means something. This is a band that makes you stand up and pay attention, causes you to expand your record collection, makes you open to new endeavors and ideas, not to mention take mind-altering substances. Commercially, the album didn't break any records, but it did spend 4 weeks on the Billboard 200 in 1988, peaking at number 164, which is pretty incredible considering the nature of the album and the musical landscape of that era. I think I would have to argue, though, that the land of and Honey was essentially the birth of industrial metal music. I'm sure a few people will be screaming at the screen, shouting, but what about Killing Joke and their debut album from 1980? While I don't think Killing Joke had the same level of aggression that was on display with Ministry for it to be classed as industrial metal. And then we do have the debut EP by Godflesh, which deserves a mention, but again, this is more just straight up industrial and experimental, as opposed to melding multiple genres with industrial. Although something that came along a year after Laura by a French industrial group from Paris in 1986 is the self-titled debut record by Trepanum Pal, released in 1989. Absolutely worth checking out, and for sure is a great example of early industrial metal music along with Ministry. Now, the final record that must be noted when discussing Ministry is, of course, Psalm 69. This is actually the name of the official record, but who the hell knows how to pronounce that? It was taken from an Aleister Crowley book. The full title of the record would come to be known as Psalm 69, The Way to Succeed and The Way to Suck Eggs, which had somewhat of an underlying sexual connotation to it. This would come to be Ministry's commercial breakthrough record, and Al Jourgensen doesn't even remember making it. I hardly recall making it. The whole thing was fucked. Sire wanted a big hit. They had tasted success with The Mind is a Terrible Thing to Taste, and were ready for Ministry's version of Thriller. There were gluttons and sycophants everywhere, as well as a team of publicists and radio promo people waiting to sell whatever we concocted to the masses like sets of Ginsu knives. It was a strange time. Alternative was the norm. Stuff that 10 years earlier would have been laughed at was being trumpeted as the next big thing. NWO, Just One Fix, and Jesus Built My Hotrod were the singles taken from this record. And good lord, to hear this stuff in 1992 probably had parents up and down the country screaming in terror. Psalm 69 peaked at number 27 on the US Billboard 200 and even went gold and platinum in the United States over the next couple of years. A couple of years after Psalm 69, you had Rammstein form, and it's hard to not hear Ministry in Rammstein's debut album, Herzeleid, released in 1995. Since 1983, Al Jourgensen has released close to 20 studio albums with Ministry, and that's not even delving into his other side projects. And I think it's safe to say that without records such as Laura and Psalm 69, industrial metal probably wouldn't be anywhere close to sounding like what it has become today. And we can't ignore the influence on artists such as Trent Reznor and his incredible vision for 9 Inch Nails. Who knows what would have become of groups such as this if it wasn't for Ministry? And I also have to say that this is such a mild insight into Al Jourgensen's life. You would not believe some of the stuff he's been through or done. The guy should not be alive. You can read all about that in his biography, Ministry, The Lost Gospels According to Al Jourgensen. I'll put a link in the description. It is an amazing read.
You know, I mean, once we write the music, it's out of our hands. People make us bigger, or record companies and advertisements and this and that make us bigger. We don't set out to make ourselves bigger.
But the real question is, can Jesus really build a hot rod?